The day Jonathan Harker arrived at Count Dracula's castle was a day bathed in the twilight glow of the Carpathian Mountains. The journey from Bistritz had been long and arduous, traversing a landscape that seemed to grow more forbidding with each mile. The villagers whispered warnings about the castle and its occupant lingered in his mind. But Harker, resolute in his purpose, paid little heed to their superstitions. Jonathan was a man of reason, an Englishman of the late Victorian era, imbued with the belief that science and logic could unravel any mystery. He had embarked on this journey under the guise of cataloguing the extensive library of Count Dracula, a nobleman of old Transylvanian lineage. However, his true mission was far more perilous: to infiltrate the lair of a vampire and end its reign of terror. Harker's coach, an old but sturdy vehicle, rattled and swayed over the uneven mountain roads. The coachman, a taciturn local, seemed eager to complete the journey before nightfall. As the shadows lengthened, they passed through dense forests where the trees seemed to whisper amongst themselves, and the howls of wolves echoed through the valleys. At a point where the road seemed to dissolve into a mere path, the coachman halted. He turned to Harker, his eyes wide with fear. "We have arrived at Borgo Pass, sir. The castle is beyond. I cannot go further. Please, for your safety, turn back." Jonathan offered a reassuring smile and handed the man a generous tip. "Thank you, but I must continue. The Count expects me." With evident reluctance, the coachman helped unload Harker's luggage and bid him a hasty farewell. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the landscape in shades of grey and blue. Harker stood alone at the pass, his suitcase in hand, the path ahead shrouded in mist. As the night grew darker, a strange sense of foreboding settled over Harker. The wind howled through the pass, carrying with it the distant cries of nocturnal creatures. Just as he began to doubt his decision to proceed alone, a carriage drawn by sleek black horses emerged from the mist. The driver, a tall figure cloaked in darkness, motioned for Harker to enter. "Mr. Harker, I presume. The Count has sent me to bring you to the castle." The voice, deep and resonant, left no room for argument. Jonathan climbed into the carriage, feeling a chill despite the warm summer air. The horses set off at a gallop, the carriage lurching forward into the night. The journey through the darkened forest was swift and surreal. The trees, twisted and gnarled, seemed to reach out with skeletal branches, and the moon occasionally broke through the clouds, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The road, if it could be called that, wound through the forest, each turn taking them deeper into the heart of darkness. Finally, they emerged into a clearing, and there stood Castle Dracula. It rose from the cliffs like a monolithic sentinel, its towers piercing the sky. The walls, made of ancient stone, seemed to absorb the moonlight, giving the castle an almost spectral appearance. The carriage came to a halt before the imposing gate. Harker's driver dismounted and opened the door, extending a hand to help him out. "Welcome to Castle Dracula," he said with a bow, though his face remained hidden in the shadows. The massive gate creaked open, revealing a courtyard that seemed deserted save for the flickering torches mounted on the walls. Jonathan followed the driver, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. The sense of foreboding grew stronger with each step. At the entrance to the main hall, the driver stopped and gestured for Harker to enter. "The Count awaits you inside." Harker took a deep breath and stepped through the heavy wooden doors. The hall beyond was grand but oppressively dark. Tall columns rose to a vaulted ceiling, and ancient tapestries lined the walls. A large, ornate chandelier hung from the ceiling, its candles casting a dim light that barely penetrated the shadows. A figure emerged from the darkness at the far end of the hall. Count Dracula, tall and impeccably dressed, moved with an almost preternatural grace. His face was pale, his eyes dark and piercing. He extended a hand in greeting, his lips curling into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Harker, welcome to my home. I trust your journey was pleasant." Jonathan took the offered hand, noting its surprising coldness. "Thank you, Count. The journey was eventful." Dracula's smile widened, revealing a hint of his sharp canines. I am pleased to hear that. Please, come, let us retire to the library. I have much to discuss with you. Harker followed the Count through a labyrinth of corridors, each more foreboding than the last. The castle seemed a place out of time, filled with relics of a bygone era. Finally, they arrived at a large, wood-paneled room lined with bookshelves. The scent of old paper and leather filled the air. Dracula gestured to a chair by the fireplace. Please, sit. I have taken the liberty of preparing some refreshment. A servant, who appeared as silently as a shadow, brought a tray with wine and a selection of local delicacies. Harker, grateful for the respite, accepted a glass of wine. As they settled into their chairs, Dracula studied Harker with an intensity that made him uneasy. You have come to assist me with my library. I must confess, my collection is vast and in need of a knowledgeable mind. Jonathan nodded, trying to match the Count's gaze. I am honored to assist. I have some experience with rare books and manuscripts. Dracula leaned forward, his expression one of genuine interest. Excellent. There are many volumes here that have not seen the light of day for centuries. I am eager to hear your thoughts on them. The conversation drifted from the banalities of library cataloging to more philosophical topics. Dracula's knowledge was vast, his insights profound. Yet, there was an undercurrent of something darker in his words, a hint of malice that lurked beneath the surface. As the night wore on, Harker found himself growing increasingly tired. The journey, the conversation, and the ever-present sense of unease were taking their toll. Dracula noticed his guest's fatigue and rose from his chair. You must be exhausted from your travels. Allow me to show you to your room. Jonathan followed Dracula through another series of winding corridors, the flickering torchlight casting long shadows on the stone walls. They arrived at a heavy wooden door, which the Count opened to reveal a spacious but sparsely furnished room. I trust you will find everything to your liking, Dracula said, his smile returning. Should you need anything, do not hesitate to call for me. I bid you a restful night. With that, Dracula left, closing the door behind him. Harker set down his suitcase and took a moment to take in his surroundings. The room was cold, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. A large four-poster bed dominated the space, its heavy curtains drawn back. A writing desk and chair stood by the window, which offered a view of the moonlit courtyard below. Jonathan unpacked his belongings, his thoughts racing. He had read of vampires, of their powers and their weaknesses, but being in the presence of one was a different matter entirely. He knew he had to be cautious, to gather as much information as possible before making any move against Dracula. As he lay in bed, sleep eluded him. The castle seemed alive with sounds, the creaking of ancient wood, the distant howls of wolves, and the occasional whisper of the wind through the corridors. He thought of Mina, his beloved fiancée, and the promise he had made to return to her. His mission was fraught with danger, but the stakes were too high to fail. In the early hours of the morning, exhaustion finally claimed him. His dreams were filled with visions of blood and darkness, of a predatory figure with piercing eyes and a cold, mocking smile. When he awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the heavy curtains. Determined to start his work, Harker dressed and made his way to the library. He was surprised to find Dracula already there, perusing a volume of ancient lore. Good morning, Mr. Harker. I trust you slept well. Dracula's tone was polite, but his eyes seemed to gleam with hidden knowledge. Thank you, Count. I am eager to begin our work, Jonathan replied, forcing a smile. Dracula nodded. Excellent. I have laid out some of the more unique texts for you to examine. I look forward to hearing your thoughts. As Harker immersed himself in the task, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The library was filled with countless books, many of them in languages he could barely recognize. Some seemed to be ancient tomes of dark magic, their contents disturbing and arcane. Hours passed, and Harker lost himself in the work. He took notes, catalogued titles, and made mental maps of the library's layout. Despite the oppressive atmosphere, he found a strange solace in the routine of his task. Yet, he remained vigilant, aware that Dracula's eyes were never far from him. One afternoon, while exploring a particularly dusty and neglected corner of the library, Harker discovered a hidden compartment behind a shelf. Inside, he found several manuscripts that appeared to be personal diaries and journals. Curious, he carefully opened one and began to read. The entries were written in a delicate, flowing script and dated back centuries. The journal belonged to a noblewoman named Ilona, who described her life in the castle and her interactions with Count Dracula. As Harker read, he realized that Ilona had been one of Dracula's victims, lured to the castle under false pretenses and turned into a vampire. Her accounts were filled with despair and terror, detailing her gradual transformation and the horrific acts she was forced to commit under Dracula's influence. One entry in particular caught Harker's attention. Ilona wrote of a secret chamber deep within the castle where Dracula rested during the day. This chamber, she claimed, was protected by ancient wards and filled with the Count's most valuable treasures, including a collection of rare and powerful artifacts. Harker knew that finding this chamber could be crucial to his mission. If he could locate Dracula's resting place and destroy him while he was vulnerable, he could put an end to the vampire's reign of terror. With renewed determination, he carefully copied the directions and notes from Ilona's journal into his own notebook. As the days passed, Harker's suspicion of Dracula's true nature grew stronger. He noticed that the Count never ate or drank in his presence, and always seemed to avoid direct sunlight. Despite his polite demeanor, there was an air of predatory menace about him that was impossible to ignore. One evening, Harker decided to test his theory. He had read that vampires could not cross a threshold uninvited and that they had a particular aversion to religious symbols. Taking a crucifix from his belongings, he placed it prominently on the table in his room before retiring for the night. The next morning, he awoke to find the crucifix undisturbed. However, as he made his way to the library, he noticed Dracula observing him from a distance. The Count's eyes flickered to the crucifix and back to Harker, a hint of amusement playing on his lips. It was clear that Dracula was aware of Harker's suspicions and was toying with him. Realizing that time was running out, Harker knew he had to act quickly. He spent his days in the library, continuing his work while secretly gathering information about the castle's layout and its hidden passages. At night, he carefully explored the castle, searching for the secret chamber mentioned in Ilona's journal. One night, while navigating a particularly dark and narrow corridor, Harker heard a faint noise behind him. He turned to find Dracula standing there, his eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. "Mr. Harker, what brings you to this part of the castle at such an hour?" Dracula's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it that sent a chill down Harker's spine. I was unable to sleep and thought a walk might help," Harker stammered, trying to maintain his composure. Dracula stepped closer, his gaze never leaving Harker's face. "It is dangerous to wander the castle alone at night. There are many secrets here, some best left undisturbed." Harker nodded, forcing a smile. "Of course, Count. I will return to my room immediately." Dracula watched him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good night, Mr. Harker. Sleep well." Harker hurried back to his room, his heart pounding. He knew he had to be more careful. Dracula was clearly aware of his nocturnal explorations and was likely watching his every move. Yet, he could not afford to abandon his search. The fate of many innocent lives depended on his success. Finally, after several more nights of cautious exploration, Harker found the entrance to the hidden chamber. It was concealed behind a false wall in the castle's lower levels, accessible only by a series of narrow, twisting passageways. The door was made of heavy iron, covered in ancient runes that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. Taking a deep breath, Harker pushed the door open and stepped inside. The chamber was vast, its walls lined with shelves filled with ancient tomes and bizarre artifacts. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate coffin, its lid slightly ajar. Harker approached the coffin, his heart pounding in his chest. As he lifted the lid, he saw Dracula lying within, his eyes closed and his body perfectly still. The Count looked almost peaceful, as if in a deep, unnatural sleep. Summoning all his courage, Harker raised the wooden stake he had brought with him and positioned it over Dracula's heart. Just as he was about to drive it in, Dracula's eyes snapped open. With a speed and strength that defied belief, the Count leaped from the coffin, knocking Harker to the ground. "You dare to challenge me?" Dracula's voice was a low, menacing growl. "You will regret this, Mr. Harker." Harker scrambled to his feet, clutching the stake in one hand and a crucifix in the other. "I know what you are, Dracula. You will not win." Dracula's eyes blazed with fury. "Foolish mortal. You cannot hope to defeat me." The ensuing struggle was fierce and desperate. Harker swung the crucifix at Dracula, forcing him to recoil. He then lunged with the stake, but Dracula dodged with inhuman agility. The Count countered with a powerful blow that sent Harker crashing into a shelf, scattering ancient books and artifacts across the floor. Despite the pain and fear, Harker refused to give up. He knew that this was his only chance to end Dracula's reign of terror. Summoning all his strength, he surged forward again, this time managing to drive the stake into Dracula's shoulder. The vampire let out a roar of pain and fury, but the wound only seemed to make him more dangerous. He grabbed Harker by the throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. Harker struggled, his vision darkening as Dracula's grip tightened. In a final, desperate effort, Harker thrust the crucifix into Dracula's face. The Count screamed and released him, staggering back as smoke rose from the searing flesh. Seizing the moment, Harker grabbed the stake from Dracula's shoulder and drove it into his heart with all his remaining strength. Dracula's scream echoed through the chamber as his body convulsed. His eyes locked onto Harker's, filled with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Then, slowly, the life drained from them, and Dracula collapsed to the floor, his body disintegrating into ash. Exhausted and barely able to stand, Harker stumbled out of the chamber. He knew he had to leave the castle before Dracula's minions discovered what had happened. Using the knowledge he had gathered during his explorations, he navigated the labyrinthine corridors and made his way to the castle gates. The first light of dawn was breaking over the mountains as he emerged into the courtyard. He breathed a sigh of relief, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time since his arrival, he felt a glimmer of hope. Harker made his way down the mountain path, his thoughts turning to Mina. He had succeeded in his mission, but at great personal cost. He had faced unimaginable horrors and survived, but he knew that the memory of those events would haunt him forever. As he reached the village, the locals stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. Word had spread of his journey to the castle, and they seemed to sense that something monumental had occurred. Harker offered them a tired smile and continued on his way, eager to return home and begin the long process of healing. Jonathan Harker returned to England a changed man. The experience had left its mark on him, both physically and mentally. He and Mina were reunited, and together they vowed to put the horrors at Dracula's castle behind them. However, they also knew that vigilance was necessary, for the darkness that Dracula represented could always return. Harker documented his experiences in a detailed journal, hoping that his account would serve as a warning to others. He knew that there were other creatures like Dracula in the world, and that the fight against such evil was far from over. In the years that followed, Harker remained in close contact with Dr. Van Helsing, who continued his research into the occult and the supernatural. Together, they worked to uncover and destroy other vampiric threats, always remembering the lessons they had learned from their encounter with Count Dracula. The legacy of Dracula's terror was one that would not be easily forgotten. But through their courage and determination, Harker and his allies ensured that his story would not end in darkness. The light of knowledge and the strength of the human spirit would continue to shine, even in the face of the greatest evil. This extended narrative delves deeper into Jonathan Harker's journey and his battle with Count Dracula, capturing the essence of his struggle and the lasting impact of his encounter with the vampire.